All right, peeps, welcome to the Culture and People Cast. Today we have Paul Smith. He is a former guest on my long form podcast, Build High Performing Teams. But Paul, in a few sentences for this audience, would you tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me back on. So I'm an author and storytelling coach, I guess is the most succinct way to put it. So what that means is I teach the art and the science of storytelling to people at work to help them be better at their job. So whether that's to be a more effective leader, a more effective salesperson, what have you, I teach courses to leaders at work to help them be better at their job. And I
Yeah,
spend a lot of
and
my
it
time doing the research that supports that, obviously.
right. And you have two, three, how many books do you have?
5 now. I've had a couple come out
Five.
since last we spoke. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
so great.
And I can mention that
Yeah.
later. I
And
mean, the 10 stories great leaders tell is one of them, but I actually wrote a biography of a deaf man, which is just a fascinating life tale. It's worth a whole show in of itself, but he's cognitively impaired, so has a learning disability, and he's deaf and
yeah.
blind in one eye. And it's just led this fascinating life as a result of all that. So that was a fun
I
project.
think you were just working on that the last time we talked. So that's
Probably.
really great. I have a couple of your books on my shelf because storytelling is one of, I talk about the top 3 skills that people can
Mm.
have, and storytelling is one of them. So
Yeah.
I love what you're doing. What's the best thing about this work personally for you? Really being able to affect people and culture at work.
Yeah. So for me personally, I guess it's getting the feedback that what I'm doing is making a difference in people's lives and work. So, um, and as an author, you get that a lot because people read your book and then they email you or, call you or whatever. But it's the same for my coaching clients and the people I train. Like, the most memorable example is there was a guy who literally drove 200 miles just to have lunch with me because and he wouldn't tell me why until lunch. He said, I want to see the look on your face when I explain to you why I want to have lunch with you, which the whole thing, that was kind of weird, by the way. I almost
Right.
wanted the corporate security officer to come with me because I didn't know where this was going to go. Right.
Totally.
But he said, and it was all very tame. He said, one of the stories in your first book inspired me to quit my job and start my own company.
Wow.
And that same story I used to help sell the idea. What I can't remember what he was
Sure, sure, sure.
making at the time, but whatever his idea for a product was, helped me sell my first 4 clients. And it's totally changed my life. That one story in that one book, and I can't even remember what story it was now because that's been
Yeah.
almost a decade. But that lets you know you're doing something
Mhm.
right.
Mhm.
You're doing it not to earn all the royalties on the books. You're doing it to change people's lives. And that tells me
Yeah.
that was at least moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and we plant those seeds and we don't always get to see them watered and come to
Yeah.
fruition. So it was really cool that he shared that with you.
Right.
Part of why I love what I do too. So let's get really tactical
Mm.
then, about work and engagement. I'm hearing from a lot of leaders that engaging talent is a challenge. What are your overall thoughts?
Yeah. Well, that's always been a challenge, I think,
Mm.
but it must be even harder now that we're all working from home, right?
Mhm.
How do you engage a group of people that you're not in the same room with?
Mhm.
And I'm struggling with that as well, just like everybody else. My only thought about how to do that better is the same advice I'd give you if you were back at the office, but it's even more important since you're maybe not back in the office. And that is you need to connect with people more frequently. And then when you do, engage them with more stories, and we can talk about storytelling later, but not only you telling them stories, but getting them to tell you stories. So, whereas you might walk by, if you're the boss at the office and you might walk by somebody's office 2 or 3 or 4 times during the day and
Mhm.
just say hello, hey, how's it going? That kind of thing. Nobody's getting that anymore because
Mhm.
there's no office to walk by, right? So I think we need to check in with our people more frequently than scheduled Zoom calls would normally allow.
Sure.
When you do, get them to tell you a quick story about, what's happened interesting over the last 24 hours or a couple of days, or since the last time I checked in with you. Get them to tell you some stories, not just answer short questions like, how are you doing? Or what
Right.
project are you working on? Tell me a story about that. What was the most difficult problem you've been struggling with in the last 3 hours, or, whatever. So engage them in storytelling as them as the storyteller, not necessarily
Mhm.
you always.
Yeah, I love that. And that goes to my other number 2 of 3 of top skills is curiosity. I think when we're asking those
Mm.
questions, people are going to feel really valued and important to you. And so you can tell stories, but you also have to be really good at listening. So let's let the listeners in on some of your, really your theory or your research behind this. What can storytelling really do in terms of a culture or people? And are there tactical things that we can start tomorrow as maybe not even a people leader, just as an everyday employee?
Yeah, absolutely. So the culture of an organization is not defined by the company
Mm,
culture statement or values statement. It's
mhm,
defined by the behavior of the people who work there, what's rewarded, what's punished, and most importantly, the stories about those things, right? Unless your company only has 15 or 20 employees, the truth is you don't all see each other every day, right? And you don't see and hear the things that are going on that really are embodying the corporate culture. You only hear about them through the gossip and the rumors and the
mhm,
story mill about what is happening to other people. So instead of trying to fight that and make that and squash all storytelling that's happening in an organization, which is a very human thing to do, tells people telling each other stories, embrace it and say, we want to foster good stories about our culture that we want. So somebody smart once told me, people are going to talk about you whether you want them to or not.
mm,
Choose which stories they tell. And the way you do that is you tell them first. So the point is, if you want to have a strong company culture, find out who are the people who are behaving the way you want the people to behave, and the people really embodying the culture, and tell their stories. And so other people will tell their stories. And some of those are going to be failure stories. It's like, well, when Bob, cheated on his expense report and, got fired, and I mean, that's a story too, but
yep.
it's a good story because there were negative consequences to the bad behavior, and you want those stories out there as well. So, for
Mhm.
example, I'll share a short one with you, and you tell me um, what cultural elements you learned from this story.
Okay.
So, this is about Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart.
Mm,
So, when in the middle of the 1980s, Walmart had just overtaken HEB in the state of Texas as the largest retailer in the state. So the CEO of HEB literally called Sam Walton on the phone one day and said two things. First of all, congratulations, you're now bigger than us in Texas. My company's been the biggest for decades.
yeah.
Second of all, I'd love to understand why. I'd like to bring my leadership team to your headquarters on a learning mission because you're clearly doing something right. Now, Sam Walton could have told the guy to shove off, right? Like, you're our
Mm,
competitor. I ain't telling you nothing, right? But he didn't. He said, well, I don't know what I can teach you, but I'd be happy to try. So they made an appointment for these executives to fly from Texas to Arkansas to meet him at a Walmart store. On that day, at the appointed hour and time, they walk into the store, they walk around the store looking for him. And sure enough, they find Sam Walton, multi-billionaire, founder of the company, at the end of an aisle, talking to a young woman. And they start marching up the aisle, and Sam Walton stops them. He goes, Charles, the CEO of HEB, Charles, hold on just a minute. I'm not finished talking to this young woman. He was trying to sell her an ironing board cover, like literally. And he was telling her about all the different sizes and color patterns and quality and price, and eventually she picked one up and put it in her buggy and shoved off to the register. Sam Walton turns around to the CEO and all of his leadership team and said, Charles, do you know how many worn out ironing board covers are in this country? We're going to sell 1 million of them this month. Now, what can I teach you about retail? And so let's just imagine you're a new employee at Walmart and somebody just told you that story. What would you learn about company values and culture from that story? Like,
Yeah,
what do
I
you
wrote
think?
down quite a few things. So
Right?
collaboration, right?
Yep.
He was totally willing to collaborate even with a competitor.
Yeah.
Kindness, leadership, not just in the industry, but the way that he shows up, right? As a leader, as this helpful
Mhm.
leader, and also the humility, right?
Yeah, his own humility. His multi-billionaire is willing to get down in the trenches and sell an ironing board cover, right? Right. And if you were to share that story with a dozen other people, you'd get a dozen other answers
Yeah,
like customers number one,
sure.
right? He made the CEO and all those leaders wait while he took care of one customer, right? At Walmart, the customer is number one, right? So,
Mhm.
yeah, so you can see how one story can illustrate so many facets of your culture far better than a list on a piece of paper hanging in the break room or in a file drawer somewhere. So if you don't have strong company culture stories, you probably don't have a strong company culture. You need
That's
you
a
need
great
them.
one.
So you
Yeah.
need to go elicit these stories, find them, craft them, and then share them. And that's how you will create the culture that you want to have.
Yeah, and depending on the size of the organization, that could be something that as a small business, the founder or CEO could do. If
Mhm.
you're larger, you could have somebody in your marketing or communications team or even your HR team, right? I mean,
Right.
that was a lot of what I did for those 20 years in corporate was sort of this keeper of those stories, the encourager of the good ones, right? And
Right.
the clarifier of the, well, I'm not sure that's
Exactly.
exactly how it went down. So
Yeah.
it's storytelling, such an amazing tool. I always tell them, like, if you want to move your ideas and or your career forward, storytelling is one of the
Yeah.
best ways to do it.
And that clarifier of the bad ones too, that just, let me just add to that. Um, you can't really get rid of those bad stories,
No.
but by fiat. You can't just tell people, "Oh, stop telling that bad story." They
Right.
won't. You have
Nope.
to replace them with good stories,
Mm,
stories that you want
mm,
circulating, and the good stories will just crowd out the bad ones just by volume, right?
yeah.
So
And there's so many leaders
tell
that I've
people.
talked to who have said, "Oh, we have a zero gossip policy here." And I will push them like what you're saying is gossip. You're viewing with a malicious intent or something, right? This negative connotation when really could we just look at it as human connection,
Mhm.
right? As one part is human connection and part of the culture, right? If you don't like those stories, then you better create new ones. So I think that's
Yes,
great
exactly.
advice.
Give them better
Yeah.
stories to tell.
Yeah. Well, let's do quick shout outs. Are there any other leaders that you've worked with in the past or work with now that are doing really great work within organizations around culture and people?
Yeah, and yeah, forgive me if these are the same ones I mentioned last time. I don't remember,
No.
but um, Steve Blair, who's the VP of People and Culture at the Harvest Group, is just doing some really creative stuff around people and culture. And I think you'd benefit talking to him. Another guy's John Wortman, Wortmann. So he's an author like me, an executive coach. He's got a lot of interesting ideas about communications inside a company
Mm.
that really affect culture. I think you'd benefit talking to him, and I can make those connections if I haven't already.
That's great, Paul. Thank you. So, Stephen, John, and what are some of your favorite resources that you would recommend to an individual contributor or a people leader that wants to truly impact their culture or their people operations?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm obviously more familiar with my own work than other people's, but I can tell you in my first book, there are two chapters dedicated to culture and values. So my first book is
Mm,
Lead with a Story. I can't remember the number of the chapters, but there's a whole chapter on
love it.
culture stories and another whole chapter on values stories. And both of those kind of work off of each other. Your values define your culture, and your culture defines your values. So you see a handful of stories in both of those that I think will help you think of better ways to improve your culture and values. And then one of my newest books that you and I probably haven't talked about is the 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. And it's about exactly what it sounds like. It's the 10 most important stories I think any leader needs to be able to tell in their company, regardless of their functional discipline or their job title. And one of those is a company values story. It's number 5, I think, on my list. And one of them is a recruiting story, a story about why you should want to work here.
Mm,
And that kind of gets at the people and culture as well. I think the other 8 are very important as well, but
yeah.
those 2 are super important in defining the culture. And in that book, you'll find an example of each of those and some tips for how to go find and craft your own stories like that.
Awesome. Well, we will link to both books, and I have the Lead with a Storybook on my shelf, so I'll go shake it
So look
off
at those
and
chapters.
figure out what are those two chapters. So we'll make sure we link to those correctly. Well, thank you, Paul, for all you're doing for not just storytelling, but really evolving the world of work and the culture and the people operations in it. I just really appreciate everything you're doing.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, thanks for being on. Peace and progress, everybody.